The gravity plate under my boots flipped without warning, and I fell upward for exactly 2 seconds before the field caught me again and slammed me back down onto the metal floor. Around me, alien cadets screamed in a dozen different frequencies. This was not the calm orientation speech they promised. This was the first trial, and it had already tried to kill me in the first 90 seconds. My name is Elena Voss, and I was the only human standing in that hall. The proctor's voice crackled through the overhead speakers, flat and bored, like he had said this line 1,000 times to 1,000 doomed cadets. Trial 1 has begun. Survive or withdraw. There is no shame in withdrawing. There was plenty of shame in withdrawing. Nobody said it out loud, but I could feel it in the way the other cadets looked at me before the trial started. A 4-armed cadet named Torvik had actually laughed when he saw my file projected above my head. Species, recently spacefaring. Combat rating, unknown. Survival probability, low. He didn't even try to hide it. He just laughed, short and sharp, and turned back to his own preparation. I didn't laugh. I asked the only question that mattered to me. Is lunch included? The hall went quiet for a second. A few cadets turned to look at me like I had grown a second head. The proctor, a tall insectoid being with too many eyes and not enough patience, tilted his head at me and said nothing at all. Then the trial began, and the gravity plate started flipping, and here we were. I want to explain something before I go further, because it matters. Humanity had only been part of the Galactic Academy for 6 months. We were the newest species to join, and by every metric the other species used, we were also the weakest. No natural armor, no claws, no venom. No ability to survive in vacuum or breathe methane or regenerate a lost limb. On paper, we looked like snacks. But nobody on that admissions committee had ever watched a group of humans stranded on a mountain ration their last chocolate bar into 6 pieces and still find something to joke about. Nobody had seen what happens when a human decides that giving up costs more energy than continuing. That was the piece of information missing from my file, and I intended to prove it the hard way. The gravity trial room was shaped like a long tunnel, split into 6 sections, each one rigged with a different type of environmental hazard. Section 1 was gravity manipulation. Section 2, according to the briefing packet nobody bothered reading closely, was heat exposure. Section 3 was toxic gas pockets. The rest, I didn't know yet, because I hadn't gotten there. Around me, cadets were dropping like insects hitting a windshield. A crystalline, being named Senik, cracked down the middle when the gravity flipped too fast for his internal structure to adjust, and 2 medics rushed in to stabilize him before he shattered completely. A cadet with gaseous form simply dispersed when the pressure spiked, unable to hold shape, and had to be collected in a containment jar and carried out. It was chaos, and it was loud, and it smelled like burning ozone and fear. I kept moving. That was the trick. Keep moving. Keep breathing. Don't stop to think about how many ways this room could end you. Halfway through Section 1, the gravity flipped again, this time sideways instead of upward. My stomach lurched and my vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I was going to lose whatever was left of my breakfast. But I had learned something on Earth long before I ever set foot on this station. When the world tilts, you don't fight it. You let your body go loose, you ride the motion instead of resisting it, and you save your strength for the moment you actually need it. I hit the wall on my shoulder instead of my head, rolled with the impact, and came up running before the gravity could shift again. Torvik, the 4-armed cadet who had laughed at my file, was not so lucky. He tried to brace against the shift with all 4 arms locked rigid, and the sudden reversal snapped one of them at the joint. He didn't scream, but the sound he made was close enough that I felt it in my own chest. I grabbed him under one arm before I even decided to do it, and dragged him toward the section exit. He looked at me with all 3 of his eyes, confused, maybe even suspicious. Why are you helping me? You barely know me. I didn't really have a clever answer. I just said the truth, because leaving you here doesn't get either of us to the end faster, and I'd rather not carry that with me. He didn't say anything else, but he let me help him, and that was enough. Section 2 hit us with heat that felt like walking into an open furnace. The air itself seemed to shimmer, and I could feel my skin prickling under the thin cadet uniform they had given me. Other species handled it differently. The ones with natural insulation barely noticed. The ones with exoskeletons started to crack and warp under the temperature, their outer shells never designed for anything like this. I had one advantage here that nobody expected. Humans sweat. It sounds almost embarrassing to admit, but our bodies are built to cool themselves in ways most of these species had engineered out of their evolution centuries ago. While Torvik struggled beside me, his breathing labored and shallow, I felt uncomfortable, but functional. We passed a cadet named Yura, a smaller being covered in fine silver fur. who had collapsed near the section wall. Her fur was matted down with sweat that wasn't hers, some kind of internal cooling fluid leaking out through her skin as her body tried and failed to regulate the heat. She was still conscious, but barely, her breathing coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't think about it, I just acted. I pulled the water pouch from my belt, the one ration allowance we were each given at the start of the trial, and pressed it into her hands. Drink. Slowly, don't gulp it. She stared at me like I had offered her something impossible. Cadets do not share rations. It is against the unspoken rules of survival trials. Everyone competes for their own resources, and helping another cadet was seen, by most species here, as a tactical weakness. I didn't care about their unspoken rules. Where I come from, you don't leave someone dying of heat exhaustion just because sharing water might cost you later. I figured I would deal with later, when later actually arrived. Yura drank slowly, the way I told her, and within a minute her breathing started to steady. She looked up at me, confusion and something like gratitude mixing on her face. Why would you do this? I am not your ally. I am not even your friend. I told her the same thing I had told myself the moment I stepped off that shuttle. Because surviving alone isn't surviving. It's just delaying the inevitable by yourself, and I'd rather not do that if I don't have to. She didn't answer, but she got up, and she kept moving with us. By the time we reached Section 3, our small group had grown without anyone officially deciding to form one. Torvik with his broken arm. Yura still shaky from the heat. A quiet cadet named Boris, whose species I still hadn't identified, who moved like he was carrying an invisible weight on every step. None of us had agreed to travel together. It had just happened, the way things happen when nobody actively decides to leave someone behind. Section 3 was the gas pockets, and this was where things got genuinely frightening. The air ahead of us shimmered with a faint greenish tint, barely visible unless you were looking for it, and the proctor's earlier warning replayed in my mind. Toxic exposure will cause disorientation, hallucination, and in extreme cases, cellular damage. Cadets are advised to identify safe pockets before proceeding. Advised, as if there was time to stop and test the air like a sommelier checking wine. I remembered something from a survival course I had taken years ago, long before I ever imagined I would be running through an alien gas chamber for my life. Gas settles differently depending on density. Heavier gas pools low, lighter gas rises. If I could read the shimmer in the air, I could guess which paths were safer than others. I told the group to stay low, to move along the floor where the denser, more visible shimmer told us the gas was concentrated but predictable, rather than the clearer-looking gaps higher up where invisible pockets could catch us off guard. It felt backward, counterintuitive, walking straight toward what looked more dangerous. But the visible danger was the one I could navigate. The invisible one was the one that would kill us without warning. Boris didn't trust the plan at first. His species, I would later learn, relied heavily on scent to judge safety, and the thick gas made that sense useless, leaving him more anxious than the rest of us. I stayed close to him, describing what I saw ahead in simple, steady words, giving him something to hold on to besides his own panic. It's clear for the next 10 steps. Then we cut left. Stay with my voice, not your instincts, just for this part. He nodded, jaw tight, and followed exactly where I walked. We made it through Section 3 without a single member of our group going down, which by that point in the trial felt like a miracle. Behind us, other cadets weren't so fortunate. I heard the alarms trigger twice, indicating medical extraction, and I made myself not look back. Looking back wouldn't help them, and it would cost us the focus we needed to keep moving forward. Section 4 was psychological isolation, and this one didn't come with visible dangers. Instead, the corridor split into narrow individual chambers, each cadet forced to proceed alone for a stretch of time, cut off from sight and sound of everyone else. The proctor's earlier briefing had mentioned this part almost as an afterthought. Isolation stress testing. Standard procedure. I hated this section more than any of the others, not because it was physically dangerous, but because it was designed to break you in a quieter, crueler way. The chamber walls were a dull gray, featureless, and the silence pressed against my ears until I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and uneven. This was where the Academy's real test began, I think. Not the gravity, not the heat, not the gas. This was the part built to make you question whether continuing was even worth it. A voice, synthetic and calm, echoed through the chamber speakers. Statistically, cadets from newly admitted species show a 78% withdrawal rate during isolation testing. You may withdraw at any time. There is no penalty for choosing survival over pride. I sat down on the cold floor, because standing suddenly felt unnecessary, and I thought about lunch. It sounds ridiculous, maybe, In the middle of a psychological trial designed to crack cadets open, I thought about the sandwich I used to eat on my grandmother's porch back home, the way she would cut it diagonally because she said triangles tasted better than squares, though there was never any real logic behind that claim. I thought about the way she used to say that hard days end eventually, and the only question that matters is whether you're still standing when they do. I wasn't going to let a synthetic voice statistic talk me out of standing. I said, out loud, to the empty gray chamber. I already told the proctor I wanted lunch to be included. I'm not leaving before dessert. Nothing responded. I hadn't expected it to, but saying it out loud made something settle in my chest, a kind of stubborn calm that had nothing to do with bravery and everything to do with refusing to let a room decide who I was. The chamber door opened without warning, and I stepped through into a connecting corridor where the rest of my group waited, each of them looking a little rattled from their own isolation chambers. Torvik's face, or whatever passed for his face, looked pale under his natural coloring. Yura's fur was standing on end. Boris said nothing at all, just fell into step beside me the moment I appeared. None of us asked each other what we had seen or heard in there. Some things, even across species, didn't need to be spoken aloud to be understood. Section 5 was the one nobody had warned us about, because it wasn't listed in the official briefing. The corridor opened into a wide chamber, and standing in the center of it was another cadet, alone, clearly in distress, pinned beneath a section of collapsed flooring that must have failed structurally sometime earlier in the trial. He was a small reptilian-looking being, his scaled skin an unnatural shade of gray from what I could only assume was pain or blood loss or both. He wasn't part of any group. He had been left behind, either by cadets who didn't notice him, or cadets who noticed and decided he wasn't worth the delay. I didn't hesitate, though some part of my brain, the tired, aching, thoroughly exhausted part, quietly suggested that hesitating might have been the smarter option. We were already behind. Every second spent helping him was a second we might not get back before the trial's time limit expired. I knelt beside him anyway. "Can you feel your legs?" He answered in a language I didn't fully understand, but the universal translator implant behind my ear caught most of it. "Pinned. Cannot move. You should continue. I am not your responsibility." I looked at the collapsed flooring pinning him down, then at Torvik's one working arm, then at Boris, whose species turned out to have considerable raw strength despite his quiet nature. Between the three of us we managed to lift the broken section enough for Yura to pull him free. He stared up at all four of us once he was clear, disbelief plain on his face despite how different that face was from any I had grown up around. "You risked your placement for a stranger." I helped him to his feet, careful of what looked like a fractured leg, and I said the same thing I had been saying the entire trial, though by this point it had stopped being a decision and started being simply who I was in that room. Strangers stop being strangers pretty fast when you're both trying not to die in the same corridor. He didn't have an answer for that, but he leaned on Yura's shoulder and joined our group without another word. By the time we reached the final section, there were 5 of us, 4 species that had never once cooperated before that day, moving together through a trial built entirely around the assumption that cooperation was a weakness. The final section, according to the layout displayed briefly on the wall, was simple in design but brutal in execution. A single narrow bridge stretched across a chamber with no visible floor beneath it, the drop swallowed by darkness that the trial's lighting simply refused to illuminate. The proctor's voice returned, sharper now, more alert than the bored tone from the beginning. "Final obstacle. 1 cadet at a time. The bridge will only support individual weight." Torvik, still favoring his broken arm, looked at the narrow bridge and then at the rest of us. "This is where we separate then." I looked at the bridge too, then back at him, and something clicked into place, some understanding that had been building the entire trial without my fully noticing it. "No. This is where we prove the bridge is wrong about us." I explained it quickly, because the trial clock was still running and every second mattered. If the bridge could only support individual weight, then we crossed individually, but we didn't cross alone. Each of us went one at a time, but the rest of the group stayed at the edge, calling out timing, watching for structural weakness, ready to react the instant something failed. It wasn't cheating the rule. It was refusing to let the rule mean isolation. Yura went first, since her light frame gave her the best odds if the bridge proved unstable. She crossed steadily, her fur still standing on end from nerves, but her steps sure and even, guided by Boris calling out warnings whenever the bridge shifted under her weight. Boris went next, his considerable weight making the bridge groan in protest, but he made it across, breathing hard, sweat beading along whatever passed for his brow. The reptilian cadet, whose name I finally learned was Eston, went third, his fractured leg making every step a visible effort, but he gritted through it, urged forward by Yura's voice calling encouragement from the far side. Torvik went fourth, his balance thrown off by the missing use of one arm, but he made it, stumbling into Boris's waiting grip at the last stretch. Then it was my turn. The bridge felt impossibly thin under my boots, the darkness below pulling at my attention in a way that made my stomach twist with every step. I kept my eyes forward, on Yura and Boris and Torvik and Eston standing at the far edge, all four of them watching me with an intensity that told me, without a single word, that they weren't going anywhere until I made it across. Halfway through, the bridge shuddered, a structural warning groan that sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my chest. I froze for half a second, my whole body screaming at me to either run or drop, neither option particularly appealing given the darkness waiting below. Eston's voice cut through my panic, steady despite the leg he could barely stand on. Left foot first. The shudder came from the right support. Trust your left. I trusted it. I stepped left, then kept moving, and the bridge held. When I stepped off the final plank onto solid ground, my legs nearly gave out from the sheer release of tension, but Boris caught my arm before I could stumble, steadying me, the same way I had steadied Torvik back in Section 1. We stood there together, 5 cadets from 4 different worlds, none of us the strongest, none of us the fastest, all of us still standing when the trial's final horn sounded through the chamber. The proctor appeared at the far end of the room, his many eyes scanning our group with something that looked, for the first time since I had met him, like genuine surprise. Trial complete. 5 cadets, successful completion. He paused, and I could have sworn his expression shifted into something almost like reconsideration. This has not happened before. Cadets typically arrive individually, if they arrive at all. I stepped forward, exhausted, aching in places I didn't know could ache, and said the only thing that felt honest in that moment. We didn't arrive individually because none of us decided surviving alone was worth it. The proctor studied me for a long moment, his gaze flicking briefly to the others still catching their breath behind me. Then he did something I hadn't expected. He pulled up my file again, the same one that had been projected above my head at the very start, the one that had listed my survival probability as low. He made a small adjustment, something I couldn't fully read from where I stood, and then he looked back at me. Your species was admitted to this academy based on technological achievement, a minimal threshold most species meet within decades of reaching space travel. It was not admitted based on this. He gestured toward Torvik, Yura, Boris, and Eston, all of them still standing beside me despite everything the trial had thrown at us. I straightened, despite how tired I was, and I asked the only question I had left in me, the same kind of question I had started this entire trial with. Does this mean lunch is finally included? For the first time since I had arrived at the academy, the proctor made a sound that might, in his species, have counted as something close to laughter. It was included from the beginning. Cadet Voss, you were simply the first one to ask. Behind me, Torvik let out a short, surprised huff of air. Yura's fur finally settled flat again. Boris allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile, the first expression I had seen cross his face all day. Eston, leaning heavily on his good leg, looked at me with something that might have been respect, or might have simply been relief. None of us said much after that. We didn't need to. Whatever the Academy had expected when they let humanity through its doors, expecting us to quit within the week, expecting me to wash out somewhere between the gravity plates and the isolation chambers, none of it had accounted for the simplest truth about my species. We don't measure survival by strength alone. We measure it by who's still at the table when the meal finally arrives, and how many people we manage to bring with us. The Academy had expected the human to quit. Instead, she asked about lunch, and then she made sure everyone around her got to eat it too.